Roberts. Would you please all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And Zack Roberts.
Good evening. You're all right today. I did an afternoon show, so I'm in pretty good shape. And I get a very nice dinner, and I thank you, Brandon. Now, can you hear me all right in the back? Okay? Let me explain why. First of all, I was a PFC in World War II. So if any of you saw Private Ryan, that was my life. I wasn't a high-ranking officer. I was down at the bottom. I became involved with the prisoners of war some time ago. In 1999 and 2000, I was the national commander for American ex-prisoners of war, of about 27,000 members that we have. But the program that you're seeing now, I do at the Non-Commissioned Officers Club down at McGuire Air Force Base. I've been doing it since about 1992, and I've done over 10,000 non-coms. I started doing a 1-hour program, but I'm infantry. And they asked for a 2-hour program, so I have 2 of my Air Force men that come in, and we all do slide presentations. We do not come in and speak because we feel as if I stand here and tell you a story, you'll never visualize what I'm saying. But if you see it on my slides, I'm sure you'll know where we're coming from. May I have the lights there, please? Now, how many, do I have World War II veterans in here? How many of you have a picture like that at home?
I don't, it's a song.
Right? Many of them do. And what we do with it, I said, sometimes I go into schools, I've done Brookdale College and a few of the others, and I said, I put this up here to let them know that I wasn't always this old. You know, like, then they doubt that it was me. But at least they know that I was young at one time. Now, I'm going to talk about the Italian campaign. The Italian campaign was conceived by Winston Churchill. And the reason for the Italian campaign is they wanted to take as much strength down from France as they could to prepare France for the Normandy invasion. So this was the first thought. Now, I was in North Africa. I did not fight in North Africa. I came in later, and then I went up into Italy. Now, when we got up into Italy, you'll see Salerno, and it was in October. The Germans were pretty well prepared for the invasion. But take a look at the map. Now, you'll see that serrated line up at the top. That's called the Gustav line. Now, the Gustav line was dug in dirt, and then what they did is they put in concrete pillboxes into the dirt, covered them over, and only had slits coming out. It was almost impossible to take them out with artillery fire or whatever. And the only way you could do it is get really in close. And the Gustav line, again, Monte Cassino, was impossible for the troops to go up there. So that was one of the reasons it was bad in Italy in the mountains. But they went in October. The Germans were pretty well prepared. Now, the other reason was the month of November, I was there. It rained 27 days. The 4 days it didn't rain, it rained at night. So you can imagine what it was like. The weather was like this. The mud was like this, the 4-wheel Jeep. And if you take a look, and tanks weren't even moving in it, but infantry have to live out in this weather. Now, when you got up into Italy, the first part, and then November, when you got up into the mountains, it turned into snow. Now, all of my illustrations were done by Bill Malden. I think it's one of the greatest books of World War II to me. Bill Malden traveled with the 45th Division. I never met him, but I knew him. I've seen him at different times around. But this one up there says, remember that warm, soft mud last summer. Because what happened in the mountains in Italy, and why it was bad, first they would bring supplies up so far. Now if they brought the supplies here, they stopped and they put them on mules. They put them on mules, and some Italian soldiers who had surrendered would take the mules up to the next part. The only thing is the Germans had that part zeroed in. So if they caught the mules coming up, they were pretty good with their artillery. The hardest part is when they stopped, we were at the top of the mountain. The only way we could get supplies is walk down the mountain, pick up the food or water. The water you had to be careful with because you put it on your back and it was very heavy going up into the dispense with the others. And you take your water and your food into the mountains. The bad part about this is trench foot or frozen foot. We were losing so many men with frozen feet that they would crawl down out of the mountains on their hands and knees. They could not actually walk. And if they have to be careful with the frozen feet because it goes into gangrene, turns black, and is amputated. And I'll show you that later on. But these men are up into the hills, and they're into combat. Up here I had 27 straight days, and I thought that was a long time until I found out another outfit had about 60 days of straight combat. Now, I was in Anzio. I'd been in the mountains first, came down, and went down into Piedmont, Italy. I had a nice shower, the first shower I'd had in a couple of months, from October, I think, to December. Had a nice shower and a change of clothes and fresh food. The sacrificial lamb, you know, they were getting us ready to send out again. And we went up to Anzio. But when the infantrymen go in, and the weather was pretty cold, it was in January. But you have to remember, when infantry go in, there's no change of clothes. There's nothing, no changing, no nothing. You're just self-sufficient. And this was Anzio, what it looked like at that time. A little bit of trivia: the birthplace of the Roman Emperor Nero. Another, it's about 36 miles south of Rome, southwest of Rome. I went back 35 years later with my wife, and I stopped and I landed about down in here. And when I got on the landing craft coming up from Italy, Naples, coming up, just a landing craft, I got deathly seasick. 17 days over, I didn't get sick. From Naples to Anzio, I got sick. And I remember I almost crawled out, and as soon as I did, shells started coming in. You know, I forgot I was sick. I actually forgot I was sick when the shells started coming in. I was frightened. But notice this land behind here. That's the Pontine Marshes. Now, the Pontine Marshes is one of the better works of Mussolini. What it was is marshland, and he had it drained. And because farmland in Italy was at a premium. It's one of the better works of Mussolini. He created about 12 to 1,500 farms in it and put some industry down there. This is actually D-Day, but many people don't know what infantry carry into battle. Now, how many saw Private Ryan? Few? Okay, well, you know. And the infantry, when you go in, you can see the packs. You have your blanket, you have your shelter half, you have whatever clothing you have your food on the back, you have your water, you have bandoliers, you have hand grenades, maybe a BAR, light machine gun, whatever you're carrying. Could be anywhere from 65 to 100 pounds, and you're in the water. And you go in. And it's amazing when I hear some of the people who went to see Private Ryan, and they turn and they say, "Do you know that first 10 minutes in the movie, I couldn't stand it. I had to go out." I said, "How would you like to have been one of those soldiers in there, going in and couldn't go anywhere?" Then one of my other friends who had never been in service said, "American generals made a big mistake, you know. He didn't get his men in off the beach." I said, "You ever stop to think there were some German generals up there that didn't want them to get in off the beach?" See, so it becomes a matter of perspective. What do you do in 10 minutes if you can't stand the movie? Now, this is the Anzio, what it looked like. The foreground here is the Mussolini Canal. These are men, and those are the farms. But notice how flat the land is. We could not get up and walk across the land because we were open to complete observation, either our mortars or artilleries, whatever came in. The canal was a break for us, in some ways a barrier. And this is called Aprilia, or the factory. This was created an industrial part. This, when the invasion went in, it only went in so many miles and they stopped dead because they were afraid of getting cut off, and they built up the forces. But this one here, we'd shell it and we'd kick the Germans out. They would come back the next day and kick us out. But the only trouble with something like this, it's what they call firefights when you go in at night. And the worst thing that infantry can have, to me, outside of artillery fire, which is the most deadly, is firefights when you're close enough to be in rifle range of somebody, or close enough for hand-to-hand. It gets too scary. And you're in here. But in the back is what they call the Alban Hills. Now, the Alban Hills part, They always say infantry should take the high ground. For some reason, we didn't take the high ground because they didn't want to go too far. But the Germans would sit up at those Alban Hills, and they would look down to Anzio. They could see everything that went on, everything. So what they would do is they had a railroad gun. We called it Anzio Annie. This gun is down in Bethesda, Maryland, if anybody is down there at any time. Now, when this gun was there, they'd put it into the tunnels, and they'd leave it there, and it's different hours. They would stagger the hours. They'd bring it out, and then they would fire, and they'd have their targets selected all the way down at the beachhead. And they could do them very easily. They just bury the loads a little bit. When it went over your head, it sounded like a jet going over, that big shell. And they did a lot of damage with this, a lot of damage. Now, going back and forth on Anzio, you had to go to the British called it a wadi, I call it a drainage ditch. And as all you had to do was go back and forth in here. Now, sometimes you would have to dig in near them, but you couldn't dig in and stay there, especially at night, because what would happen is the Germans would come up and could throw a hand grenade down in the ditch, and they'd just fire a machine pistol up the line and take out a whole squad or platoon just with grenades. So you couldn't stay in these. You had to go through them. The only thing wrong with them is when it rained, it filled with water. Now, this one, of course, is wished I could stand up and get some sleep. And it's true, because one of the worst things that happen in the infantry is wet feet. You have no change of shoes or socks, you're rough going. And this one I like because I think it explains quite a bit. This says using 2 blankets or 3. Now at Anzio, what it was marshland that had been drained. And the marshland was drained, you could only go down 2 or 3 feet. That's it. And the water would come into the hole. But when you're up there, now I had a shower in December in the Piedmont, Italy, before I went up to Anzio in January. February 16th I was captured, but I had not had a shower in all this time. People don't realize that when you're infantry, what happens, it's not just the fighting, it's the soldiering that can be a problem. The soldiering. These men are so dirty. You see that beard? The reason he has a beard, he doesn't have anything to shave with. The only thing they have is drinking water, a canteen cup that they carry, nothing else. So they can't use this water to shave. You can't take a bath. That's impossible. These men are so dirty that if they tried to shave, they'd have an immediate infection. Now, how do infantry, when they come down from the lines, how do they wash? What you did is you took your steel helmet and you heated water. And you heated the water in it, you stripped down, and you did a sponge bath. If you were lucky, you might have clean clothes. If you didn't, you had to put the same clothes back on again. So that is the only way you wash when you're coming down from the infantry in those positions. There's no such thing as a shower there. One of the things that you'll find most is post-traumatic stress. And people say, well, how does post-traumatic stress work? And this will be for your friend over there with the uniform. Post-traumatic stress is simple. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 people over here in a row, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's only part. So I have 12 in a squad. This morning, 12 men have breakfast, and we have maybe get around and gather a little bit. All of a sudden, artillery or firefights come in, half of your men are gone. Half are gone. Infantry had 400 and some replacements in some of the divisions, as high as 400% replacements. Now, you see the one go. So finally, the one guy goes, the last man starts thinking, hey, wait a minute, when is it my turn? You know, you start building. You start losing your friends. Men come in you don't even know. And then when you say Purple Heart comes in varying degrees. I have a Purple Heart. I was wounded in the back, but I didn't pick it up till 50 years later. And the reason I didn't, when I came home, I had the wounds, and it sent us to Atlantic City, and for a recuperation period when we came home, I had a 68-day leave, and then they sent me down there. And over here we had the guys with the wounds, like mine, walking wounded. And the next hospital, they had all the amputees, all the men with arms and legs off, 2 arms and legs off. And I didn't feel comfortable getting the same Purple Heart that a man with 2 arms and legs got. I just didn't feel comfortable with it. But then 50 years later, I mellowed and I finally got it. But you don't know the story of a lot of these Purple Hearts and what they've gone through. Now again, when you say post-traumatic stress, now in World War I they called it shell shock. World War II was anxiety neurosis. A lot of my friends objected to that term, anxiety neurosis. It sounded like you were a little bit off the wall. And of course, Vietnam, it became post-traumatic stress. Now these are men like this who actually refused to fight on the front lines. They actually refused to fight. They take off, they threaten with a court-martial, they could threaten with anything they want. They said, I'll go down, I'll drive a truck, I'll cook, I'll go in the back, but I will not go in the front. You could not put these men back. I did not realize until a few weeks ago how many men had been recycled after the Battle of the Bulge, and I'll go into that later. But you have men who wouldn't fight. Then you have men like this that came down and they wouldn't talk to you, especially when you went up and you came down with 50 and 60% casualties or your squad was gone. They won't talk. They leave you alone. If you go to Alliance Hospital today, you'll see men up there 50 years later that never went home. And how do they treat this? With medication. They give you an upper and a downer, and then they have to monitor that you don't have a liver damage. The drugs can't do it. You can't take a man's mind out. And I've taught some of this. I said, if you have a house, and you keep your house and you keep it dirty, and you left garbage accumulate in it, and just left it accumulate, you'd have rats in, you'd have mice in the house, you'd have bugs. You couldn't live in the house when it gets dirty. If you keep garbage in your mind, you're going to ruin your health and your life. You've got to take garbage out of your mind. You have to take it out. Now, I told you about the trench foot, the frozen foot. This man was up here with a frozen feet. These boots were given after the Battle of the Bulge, during the Battle of the Bulge, because during the war, the Battle of the Bulge, they actually lost 15,000 men with frozen feet out of the Bulge, sent back. Now, the other amazing part is, when I found out lately that they recycled 1 out of every 5 soldiers. We had 1 or 5 out of 5 that wouldn't fight anymore. And they would go back and give them a shot of sodium benzoyl in the arm, give them clean clothes, shower them, and send them back. They recycled men who were breaking up. But these trench feet, again, as I said down in Italy, you had to be careful. Come down, they turn black. They come down to the bottom of the hill, they turn to gangrene. If they went in too far, they would be amputated. I have some of my friends that just had toes off recently. Now, I was with Company E, 179th Regimental Combat Team, 45th Division. If you notice, that is Aprilia, the factory that I showed you before. This is where I was, right here. It took me 35 years to find out what happened to me till I read a book. But anyway, we dug in. And that was a whole battalion, but my company was E, and that was the one they hit. So the morning of February the 16th, they started an artillery barrage. Now the artillery barrage, they put it in and they do the yardage in one spot. Then they change the yardage going down. Now you're saturated shelling. Now if you're infantry and you're experienced infantry, when you come in, you lose a long hole to sleep in, but when artillery's come, you dig a hole straight down this way. And it's small, just so that you can go down and you'll get better coverage. So we always had 2 holes, one for sleeping and one when the artillery came in. The guys who didn't dig, they paid for it. So on the 16th, they come in, they finished the shelling. Then about 35 fighters come over, just came over and just strafed and dive bombed that one area. And they left. And when they left, I found this out later, 5 waves of 500 infantry. I didn't find this out. That was February the 16th. February the 17th, we had to drop back. Because out of my 200 men, we had 18 left. 18 left out of 200. On the morning of the 17th, it was pretty busy. We had problems. But on the morning of the 18th, we had 4 men left. That was it. 4 men. And this is what happened. Now you'll see the line up here, and this is what I tell you with the infantry when they were dug in. Remember those men that came in with wet clothes off the beach, they walked it miles, 10 miles in. Then when they got 10 miles in, they dug a hole. And they're still in their wet clothes. But this is the type of hole. You notice that's straight down. The sleeping hole is behind. So the morning of the 18th, there were 4 of us left. Now 200 men covering a line like that, as 4 men couldn't possibly cover it. So up the road came a German tank, and as all they do is they take and they wave the nozzle at you. That's it. They don't want to waste a shell on you because they have to go back and reload. So they don't do that. So they just wave it. That means come out or else. And then the infantry comes up and picks you up. Somebody said, what do you think, Zack, when you saw them coming up, you know, the tank and the infantry? I said, I still say the same thing on the golf course. Oh, shucks. You know, I take a look, oh boy, you know what I mean, fellas, play off the magic word back. But that's how we were picked up. Now, when you're first captured, the most dangerous time is the first 24 hours because you're in the front lines. Now, what happens in the front line is this. If, let's say, there's 5 of you here, and all of a sudden a German soldier killed your best buddy, and you got a chance to take him a prisoner, will you take him a prisoner or will you shoot him? Now, I used to tell one story on this till I met a survivor of the Malmedy Massacre, and he told me the way it happened. They were in the field, and they were lined up and in the field, and half-tracks came down, and they opened up with machine guns. And they just machine gunned the men in. And then they walked. These are American bodies. They're all down there. Then the Germans walked among the men, they kicked them. And if they were still alive, they executed them with a shot to the head. Now, this is well put out, and it was well done. The SS men who did this were brought to trial, but nothing much happened to them. It was almost a bit. So the first 24 hours is the most important until you get back in. Now, I tell a little bit about airmen, even though my friends talk about it. But when some of the airmen, now if you fly, do I have any Air Force men in here? Okay. You're flying, were you shot down? Nope, okay. So you're flying and imagine somebody shooting at you, wanting to take you out of the sky. My one friend's plane, who lectures with me, was hit. He went out, prop took his leg off from landing down. He was unconscious in the chute. He woke up, he looked down, his leg was gone. Another one of my friends, they put a 20-millimeter shell through his leg. He had to bail out. They opened up his chute, rolled him up in it, and threw him out. He's still living, but goes along. But each one of these airmen that came down all have different stories. Each one is completely different. I'm just relating 2 that I'm familiar with. Now, when these men came down, this is Regensburg, Germany. You have to remember that underneath this rubble is somebody's mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters. Your home is gone, your job is gone. Everything is gone that you own. It's gone. So naturally, when these airmen came down, what happened when they came down? Some were beaten to death, some were hung, some were shot before they got back into a camp. But this happened everywhere. German flyers coming down over London received the same treatment. German flyers coming down over Russia received the same treatment. So it's part of the war going back, the anger. Now, how did I get from Italy to Germany? In a boxcar. This is called 40 and 8. 40 men, 8 horses. You'll notice the ventilation is only a little window up there. But in this boxcar, we came up from Italy. They said I had a shower in December. This is now June. I'm still in the same clothes, without a shower, all those months. But I wasn't alone. The whole boxcar had men in the same thing. So they crammed us in as tight as they could. And to go to the bathroom on it is all they have is a litter box, like you'd have for a large animal. Wooden box, dirt in the bottom, a lid on it, and that was the litter box. That's if any of the men had to go to the bathroom. But all of these men had not been showered, no change of clothes for months and months. So the inside of that boxcar was an indescribable odor. You could smell it miles away, just from body odors coming up. And we came up from there, and then they left us in the rail yards in Munich for a couple of nights. They said Hitler didn't want to feed us anymore. He didn't have any more food. Then they wanted it for propaganda purposes. They said, well, what happens is if the Allies kill their own prisoners, the Germans are free. They didn't do it. But we arrived up at Stalag 7A, and we were all suffering severely from malnutrition and dirt, filth, and so on. When we got up there, they had the German SS troops lined up, the black uniforms, the bared bayonets, and they tried to get us to walk. The men couldn't walk. So we went to the Stalag 7A in Moosburg. Now this was the biggest camp in Germany. In one part they had English troops, one part Russian troops, one part for Indian troops, all mixtures from all over, all of the Allied, separated. And this is what the camp looked like. And you'll see the camp, but I'll explain part of the wiring and some of the rules and regulations later. Now, this is a delousing, but I use this after because this was actually after the war. This is Romanian prisoners. When we arrived at Stalag 7A, they walked in, and we just like taking everybody in this room and stripping you to bare naked. Strip you right down to the bone. No clothes. They shaved every hair off your head. They shaved your eyebrows, shaved your armpits, your privates. We had my first shower in over 6 months. They took my clothes, they killed the lice in them, like that. And they gave them back to me. So I had my dirty clothes with dead lice. And they were lice infested, but now I had a chance to wash them up and clean them up. So it's not only a prisoner of war, it's what you endure. This I'll explain, camp regulations. The Germans, because of the division of nationalities, had to be very, very strict in some camps. And I'll explain one of the rules in particular later. Now this picture here is one taken, and one of my friends found it. And my mother got it before I got home, and she saw my eyes closed. And when she did, she thought I was blind. So she was a little upset. But on the back of this is my hospital record. Now, when we came home, the American soldier, a prisoner of war, didn't have any medical records. So that means if you were sick and you were in a hospital and never been captured, you had medical records. But when you were a prisoner, there were no medical records. So I was very fortunate. First, I had been wounded, and I had infections. But the most serious part is I had to work. Now, in different camps were altogether different. Air Force camp was completely different than an infantry camp. Air Force camps were mostly officers and non-commissioned officers. The infantry was mostly PFCs and so on. We had to work at various jobs. One airport I worked, at this airport here, and they had German fighter planes there. One day the Americans came over, one wing turned over, and they bombed the airport. I was very lucky. I ran into a big hole, though it had been dug for air raid shelters. A bomb hit from here to that back wall, even closer than that. I was the first one in the hole, second one in the hole, 2 German soldiers on top of me. One of the German soldiers screamed, and when the bombing stopped, I looked, but a big rocket hit him, and it really did a job on his ribs and his back, and he went out. So he was in pretty rough shape there. But now, I got on a different detail. I had to load bodies. All of the German dead bodies, we had to go into a hangar and go into the plane and take a shovel and put them in boxes, the one that was burned. We had to take the other ones and pile them onto a truck. Now we took them down into an undertaker down in town. And the detail that I was with, we put them against the wall. We started here, and the bodies got high, and we were just throwing them up into a pile. There were so many bodies that we were piling. I have no idea how many it was. I've heard all numbers from 100 to 800. I don't know. But we piled them. And while we were throwing the bodies up, one on one arm, one on the leg, one of the arms came off of one of the bodies. And one of the friends, one of the Americans started to laugh. Well, the Germans stood outside, When they saw him laughing, they flew. They were ready to come in. But fortunately, some German guards stopped it. They had the machine pistol. So I had to load bodies here. That was one of my other jobs. Then later on, I had to go out and work after the airport, and I had to work in a farming community. I had to work in a milkery. They were building a dairy extension. While they were building that, I had to go out and we drove teams of oxen and carts. Now, when we went out to the field, it was raining, and we were digging the gravel, and with that, we had an overhang. So it was raining, and I went back and under the overhang, got down on my haunches to get out of the rain. And when I did, somebody said, "Zack, look out." And I went to leap forward, and I cut the whole top of the gravel bank on my back here. And it crushed my back down, up to the neck, my hands, my body, everything. And I couldn't walk. I couldn't walk. I had a German guard. Now, German guards were 4F. German guards were men that weren't fit for the front. One of our guards had cancer. The one that I'm talking about had a heart condition. He happened to be a very compassionate person. If it had not been for this one German guard taking care of me, I'm sure I'd either been dead or permanently crippled. He got me to a Stalag 7B hospital. This German guard did a lot in this out in here. At the end of the war, when some of the soldiers were stuck in the field, he brought them down, he put them into his home, in his cellar. This German guard could have been shot for that. At the end of the war, when it went out, he told us the troops, our American troops, would be in the next day. He gave us, he went out, locked our gates, threw the keys into us, and told us, "Don't make any noise, nothing, be very quiet. Because if they come in tomorrow, the SS comes in the end, they'll pick you, they'll do two things, either take you back or shoot you. So be quiet." So because of this, now I was there in a German hospital and couldn't walk. So I was in pretty rough shape, the lowest point of my life. Now you get to Stalag 7, out to one of the camps. The inside of these barracks are so infested with lice, fleas, and mice that you can't sleep. This was not usually allowed in the camps, but you'll notice the clothes out to dry. At least we could wash clothes and dry them out in the barracks up here. The inside of the barracks, what was it like? It's a piece of canvas filled with straw. If their shoes wore out, they were issued a pair of clogs, which weren't too good. Barracks were unheated. They had one stove in the middle. You didn't have enough wood for it. So you couldn't have heat in the winter that much. Wood you had to scrounge whenever you could on a work detail. You'll notice the men are sleeping with hats on. It's a simple part that if you're ever cold, you put a hat on, you're 10 degrees warmer. Well, they slept with their clothes on, slept with their hats on. If they went out for roll call the next morning, they carried their blankets with them. And you'll notice this Red Cross parcel. Down in Italy, I'll explain the diet I had. And if it had not been for the American Red Cross and the American Red Cross parcels that supplemented my diet, I'm sure I'd have been in a much different shape. I put this in here just to show you how much privacy you lose in your life. How much privacy you lose. This one is a Russian soldier that tried to escape. When he tried to escape, the Germans shot him, and they left the body there for a few days, just to remind you not to try it. Once they did something, they were pretty good. Now the wiring I said I would explain. The main wire would be down the middle like this. On this side over here, about 8 to 10 feet in, you had another string. It was called a warning wire, and another one on the opposite side. So you had warning wires in the camp and the middle of it down. What happened here is an American took a cigarette and threw it over to a Russian, tossed it over. It didn't clear the warning wire. The Russian soldier walked into the warning wire and was shot, killed. Now the sad part about this is there are actually recorded cases of long-term prisoners of war who could not stand the confinement, who walked into these warning wires deliberately to commit suicide. The diet. In the morning, Had a canteen cup. Had a canteen of black coffee, artificial coffee, ersatz coffee, whatever you want to call it, no milk or sugar. Lunch was a piece of black bread. Could be anywhere from 4 to 8 men, depending on the supply. So if I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 right here, I give you 1 loaf of bread like that for 8 of you. 1 loaf. Today you cut the loaf, tomorrow you cut the loaf, tomorrow you cut the loaf. Cutter always took last choice. That meant you measured the bread out exactly before it was cut. And dinner was a cup of watery soup, cabbage, or whatever. This is going to be dinner for 135 men. What happens with this diet? This is 100 pounds in 100 days. So when you say, even myself sometimes when I want to get a little bit of weight off, I think, I'm not going to try this diet. Not going to do it. But you actually record 100 pounds in 100 days. Now many think some of the Holocaust pictures non-Americans look like this. This is an American soldier. Now again, in the camps you had different camps. All camps were not the same. The Air Force camp was a better camp because of goring. Then the infantry camp was another type, but this man was in an isolated camp where they couldn't get up to him. He couldn't do anything. And this man was living a long time. The last I heard, he was still alive. But it's anorexia, and what happens is the body starts living off of itself. Now, I don't know of a single long-term prisoner of war who had this diet, did not have severe gastrointestinal problems the rest of his life. I had a friend, an English soldier that I knew came home, all he could drink is a shot glass full of milk at a time. That's it, because the stomach had shrunk that much. When I did this lecture for prisoners of war in Pennsylvania, one of the men were there, and he said, well, I was in that section of the camp, Zack. They put them up there, and they gave them milkshakes and did whatever they could to build them up and bring them along because they were in bad shape. Well, they put the mess tent over there and the men over here. These men were starving men, hadn't seen food. Some of the men broke out, went into the mess tent, ate too much food, and actually died from overeating, just because of that. This one here is American soldiers being carried out, and you can see the boots. One man there is one of our past national commanders for the prisoners of war, and he was on it, and he was in a bad situation in the camps. He had been wounded and he had to have surgery. They didn't, American doctor only had razor blades and something to cut with, and he said, you're going to have to do surgery on you, Earl. And Earl said, well, what happens if you don't do the surgery? He said, if I don't do the surgery, you're going to die. He said, I don't have any choice, do I? I've got to have the surgery. So he is one of these men. Now he's a great big guy like this, and so whenever I see him, he said, Zack, I was thin once, and I'm going to be fat, and I don't care what anybody says. And he makes it. He's big. He's big. Now, it's not only being a prisoner of war, again, the camps and where you're at. This man here, because of the diet, because of the sanitary conditions, this man has TB. Now, you know what TB is. Infectious hepatitis, liver conditions. I came home with infectious hepatitis from in there. Didn't know I had it, among other things. But this is what happens. Now you hear of the Bataan Death March. Now, the Bataan Death March as well, but this one here is an 89-day march. Now what happened here is as Allied troops advanced, the Germans moved them out of the camps and went. Now I have one of my friends that wrote books on this. Some of them, when their shoes wore out, they took pieces of bark and put them in there. Americans strafed a column with German horses. The men went over, took the hind leg off the horse, took it out, and they barbecued it. They had food. It was a bad winter. The men only slept in barns wherever they could. There was no place to really sleep. They just went in where there was hay. No dogs and cats on the road. They disappeared. They were taken, skinned, and gone. Well, the men actually starved 89 days on this march. Primitive conditions. The sickest man they would take and put on a sled, and some of the others would try to pull him. It's an amazing story. I could spend a whole afternoon on this, a whole hour on this story alone. This is some of the better fed French and English prisoners who had been in there a long time. Some of the French soldiers had been captured at the early part of the war and went into Germany, and they actually worked in production of some part. They became part of the German community for a while. And then, of course, I told you about the post-traumatic stress and some of the other. And this one is Forever a Men Hit the Dirt, and again, it's by Bill Malden. And when I lecture at the NCO Academy, some of them say, well, to explain to you with the post-traumatic stress, I explain that you've got to take garbage out. And I tell them, of course, there was never an atheist, as everybody knows, in the foxhole. There was no atheist. But what happened is if a Russian came down, or a Jewish rabbi came, or a Catholic priest, whoever came, and they'd say, would you men like to pray? Nobody ever said, well, what denomination are you? We took all the help we could get. We took any prayer that came. But on this part here, I tell the people, I said, I'm not a preacher, but I'm a believer. I'm a believer. I believe in every person's life, somewhere, you're going to face a time where you have no place to turn. You have no parents, no husband, no wife. Somewhere you're going to be alone. And I don't know what you're going to do. I've been in there. I was hopeless in Germany. I couldn't walk. 20 years old. I had problems. And I don't know what you did, but I know what I did. And I'm not telling you what to do. But I believe that the strength of a person has to come from in their heart and in their mind. The mind has to overrule a lot of the body, regardless of what you're doing. You'll hear people who are hypochondriacs will say this or this. I'm almost when I complain every morning. Always got a different ache. But somehow you go through it. And I believe that somehow this is the way that you survive. And then, of course, this is Anzio back there. I went back to the tune of 35 years later. And my wife and I went back with her. My wife and I went. And I went down to the cemetery, and I looked through the cemetery, and I saw all the ages. And I was very thankful that I was where I was and not down there. But it bothers me when I see Memorial Day especially. Especially Memorial Day and Veterans Day are not, to me, are not shopping holidays. To me, that's the day that I would love to see people somehow remember a man who gave his eyesight, a man who gave his mind, still in the hospital, a man who gave an arm or a leg or shed his blood, all for us. And that's the one that I want mostly, is to remember all of the young men like this who gave up all of their todays and tomorrows so that you and I can be free as we are today. And I thank you very much. I see a prisoner of war here. I don't know who you are, but I recognize a red jacket. Hi.
Joe Barrett.
Huh?
Joe Barrett from Chapter 2.
Okay, Joe.
I'm the treasurer.
I didn't know of it. Another prisoner of war. I'm surprised you're here. Glad to have you. But anyway, so that's part of it. You know, I left out one part. When I went back, 35 years later, I thought I'd go back to Germany and meet Franz, look him up. So my wife and I went back and went down to Munich. And we drove from Munich on down. So to Tusenhausen. And it was a Sunday. Well, on Sunday, people don't come out. They're all in, it's a farming community. So I only speak a dialect of German. So I went down, and my wife said, well, talk to somebody. The streets were deserted, very small town. So a man came out, and I told him my story in my broken German. He said, wait a minute. He walked back in the house, and out sent a young girl out. Now the young girl came out, and I told the story again in my broken German, second time. She said, wait a minute. She went back in the house and came back with another woman. Turned out, I told the story the third time. I found Franz's widow and his daughter in Germany. And they took me back to a tour through Tusenhausen, which wasn't necessary. You only had to walk around a block, but they were very gracious to us. And They took us into their house. They had desserts that were remarkable. They gave us coffee. I didn't get along real well in the German, but we got along. I came home. They sent me cards. I corresponded to them. So I sent Christmas cards to my guard's widow and daughter, and they sent Christmas cards to me. Now we ran into problems. They write a letter in German. I have to get a German interpreter to read it. So I said, I'll get even with that. My wife writes back in English, let them get an interpreter. So all of a sudden, they haven't come through, but it's one of the nicer stories of the war. One thing that happens, people say, do you meet good and bad? You meet good and bad in everybody. You know, I don't care. I don't care where you're at. I don't care what country you're in. You'll meet good people and bad people. I have some of my relatives I don't like particularly. I'm sure some of you may. Maybe some of your in-laws. I don't know. So it works out. But it was a great... But anyway, this 99 and 2000, I was the national commander for American ex-prisoners of war. And it was quite an honor. We have about 27,000 people. But the best part that it did for me is I testified before Congress on veterans' problems. And I worked on legislation on legislative committees. But the prisoner of war has laid the groundwork for a lot of other veterans. So although I'm a life member of DAV and a life member of Purple Heart, we don't work there. We try to work with all veterans because I think every veteran who served in some capacity deserves some benefits. Thank you. Yes.
Ask them if anyone has a question. Does anyone have a question?
Any questions? These people are pretty good. They took me out for dinner tonight. They run the microphone. Yes,
Sir, as a prisoner of war under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, it's your duty to try to escape. Did you organize any escape units?
That's a dream world. I'll tell you right now. Now let me tell you what happened in a prison camp. And I'll tell you what happened in Stalag 7B. Stalag 7B was predominantly Jewish. They did not mistreat the Jewish people. What they did is they took them in another camp. They went on work details the same as I did. A German commandant, now remember there had been the Great Escape, and Steve McQueen was not in that Great Escape, all right? My friend who lectures with me explains that Great Escape all the way through. What happened after that, that was a disaster. You don't realize that 50 men were executed for escaping. They took them and executed them. So the men died because they escaped. Now, with us, they had some of them planning an escape. The commandant was a decent man. I'm telling you right now, the commandant tried to do what was right. He was pretty good with us. Strict. You know, you had to obey the rules, and there was no monkey shines, but he wanted it. So he heard about it at the escape. So we had always a man of confidence. Our man of confidence is somebody who's fluent in the language. And one of my best friends was the man of confidence in there. Now the man of confidence, he called the man of confidence over and he said, I hear the grapevine. He said, you're planning an escape. So the man looked at him sort of funny. He said, I'll tell you what, for every man that escapes, I'll have 10 executed. And you'll name the 10 to be executed. There were no tries for escapes. There were no tries for escapes.
Any other questions? Anyone? Wow. Here's one.
Wait, microphone.
Hold on.
This isn't really a question.
Okay.
This isn't really a question, but on the History Channel about a week ago, they had the German prisoners of war that were in this country. Boy,
I'm off. Okay. I'm off.
and later on, I happened to work with a few of them because they liked it so much they came back. But see, you were in a different situation.
Altogether, the German prisoners are here. The camps were actually controlled by the German officers.
Yeah.
They were actually controlled. They were here, but they were under control of the Germans. But, and I have the one, and I remember the one of the German prisoners of war came out and worked up in a farm in Wisconsin or Minnesota, one of the states. He liked it so much, he came back and bought the farm. They had a good deal. The other ones that used to kill me is the Italian prisoners on Staten Island had weekend passes. Oh, yeah, and they used to go out with all of you nice American girls while we were over there. Ah.
Does he have some things that he might
Yeah,
share?
okay, they like it done on it. Now, anything else before we have something over here?
No questions?
Brandon, do you want to introduce this gentleman?
I invited this man here tonight because he had a similar experience to Zach. His name's Joe Barrett, and he's from Garden State Chapter Number 2, American Prisoners of War. He was in the Texas Division, 36th Infantry Division. And
Say a few words on the mic.
Sure,
There you go.
be glad to. I have here the cup, the knife and fork and spoon that I used when I was a prisoner, and I managed to carry it home with me, and now it's over 50 years old, these items.
Okay,
I have my picture here. It was when I was a prisoner,
I cut it.
and I have my dog tags that the Germans issued. I was in Italy in combat, and I was captured in Italy. I spent 20 months in a prisoner of war camp in Poland. My camp was Off-Lag 64. Off-Lags were for officers, and Stalags were for enlisted personnel. During my internment there, Zack talked about escape plans, and you had a question here. We had dug a tunnel in the camp where I was. Before you could execute any escape plans, you had to go before a committee and present your plan to the committee for approval, because you didn't want to jeopardize the lives of the other prisoners. So the barracks that I occupied, they had two ends with a wash section in the center. We dug a tunnel down through the wash basin, down about 10 feet, and all the way out under the fence. Now, we had a big problem disposing of the dirt. So the Red Cross parcels that you saw here, we used to put the dirt in there, and then at night we would pass and put all of the parcels up in between the roof and the ceiling. What happened after we left, I don't know, because we had to evacuate that camp in January of 1945, where Russians were starting a big offense. We split up into two groups after we got out of there. One group wound up in Luckenwald, and that was the group I was in. The other group wound up in a camp called Hammelburg. There's a unique story about this Hammelburg. We had a prisoner among our group. It was Lieutenant Colonel John Waters. He was General Patton's son-in-law. General Patton created a special task force to go behind the German lines to liberate his son at Hammelburg. Well, they weren't successful. Quite a few of them got killed, and those that didn't get killed got captured. There's a book written by Abe Baum. He was a Jewish man from New York, and he was a captain, and he led this task force. He is now a member of the group that I also participate in addition to this American ex-prisoner of war group, which I am a life member. Our Off-Lag 64 group, we try to have meetings each year, and the last time we had a meeting was out in Spokane, Washington last year, which I did not attend. My wife is ill, so she can't travel anymore. So anyhow, I returned after the war. I went to the University of Pennsylvania, Wharton School. I graduated. I went to work for Roman Heights Chemical Company, and I retired there after 30 years. That's my story briefly. I could go into a lot more, but anything that I would say would be repeating what Commander Zack Roberts has already given you. Thank you.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now, Mr. Zack Roberts.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Can you hear me now with that mic? Okay, fine. Let me give you a little bit of background. I was captured down in Italy. I was into North Africa first, and then I went up into Italy. And I was captured at the Anzio beachhead and spent about 15 months in German prison camps. And, you know, you get different variations when you're a prisoner of war and what has happened. So what you're seeing today is a program that I do at the Non-Commissioned Officers Academy at McGuire Air Force Base. And I do it at every new cycle. I've been doing it for about 8 years and have done over 10,000 non-coms. Now, when I first started the program, they wanted a 2-hour program. Well, I'm infantry. So when they said 2-hour program, I had 2 Air Force men join me. So now we do a 2-hour program. And you know, it's an amazing thing to hear some of the stories of a prisoner of war. No matter what I did or how bad it was, there's always somebody had it worse. There's always somebody had it better, but always somebody had it worse. For some of you Air Force men, one of the men that was with me that speaks up at McGuire, he went out through cockpit somewhere of the plane, and the prop took his leg off from here down, and he was unconscious. And when he came to and he looked down, his leg was gone. And he has a great story. I wish you Air Force men would enjoy it, because he talks about the Great Escape. And he's very good at the Great Escape. He separates the fact from the fiction. He just lets everybody know Steve McQueen was not there. Had nothing to do with the Great Escape. And then I have other friends of mine, and all of the stories are different. So if you get one prisoner of war, you'll find sometimes, depending where they were at and what happened, that you'll get a different story. That is the point I'm making. One of my friends, a 20 millimeter, he was an airman, and a 20 millimeter shell went through his leg, and they had to bail out, and they took the chute, they opened the chute up, rolled him up in it, and threw him out of the plane. And he's still around. But I'm going to go to infantry. Air Force men can tell their own stories. I'll get a little bit of it. Now, if you can I have the lights, please? Now, I put this up here because sometimes I've been invited to grade schools or high schools, and I put this up here just to let the students know that I wasn't always this old looking. Now, I'm sure that everybody in this room has a picture. When you were in service, how many of you were in service, and how many had a picture like this when you were in service? There you go. So you know what it was. We look a little different now. Somebody said, gee, you don't look the same. I said, no, I improved with age. I wish. Now, the Italian campaign, some people wonder about the Italian campaign and what it was. The reason for we were in North Africa first. I did not fight in North Africa. I just went through North Africa to go supplied into Italy. But the Italian campaign was the brainchild of Winston Churchill. And why he wanted the Italian campaign is to go into Italy and draw all of the strength out of Germany, all of the troops and tanks down there, as many as he could, to come down and take care of the Italian campaign. Because now they were diluting the strength, preparing it for Normandy. Now, the Italian campaign, was it good? No. For me, no. And for others. First of all, they went in on October the 22nd, and you can see the invasion line in here. And when they did, the Germans were ready for them, and it got pretty heavy. They almost lost the position. But that was October. Now, when they started up, it was another part. So the Italian campaign got stalemated because of the mountains. Number one, the weather and the mountains. I'll go into those as I go along in my part. But we were down, and all of this is the mountain country in here, and up in there was the Gustav Line. What the Gustav Line was is the Germans had made excavations, put in concrete pillboxes, covered them over, and you couldn't find them. You couldn't take them out. It was impossible. They were up at Monte Cassino, and it was an impossibility to go through Cassino. So they stalemated, and then they went to the Anzio beachhead, which was called Operation Shingle. Anzio was up in here, and what they were trying to do was go behind that Gustav line and break it down. And that was the main objective for it, is trying to break through and get it out of there. Now, I was down, here's sunny Italy. I was there in the month of November, and the month of November it rained 27 days. The 4 days it did not rain, it rained at night. And this is what it's like. Imagine a four-wheel Jeep, tanks couldn't move, but remember, infantry live and sleep in this type of weather. They live in this type of weather. Now, they say sunny Italy, but then when you do, you go up into the mountains. Now, I was just talking to one of the gentlemen there, and I'm sure he can confirm it. Incidentally, my illustrations on here are done by Bill Malden. Bill Malden traveled with the 45th Infantry Division. I saw him. I never talked to him. I met him, but I remember somebody said that's Bill Malden going by. But he visited the front, and he actually did these. But this says, remember that warm, soft mud last summer. Now, what happened is, when you were down and you started into the mountains, you went up, it turned into snow. Now to the mountains, to get up, they bring things only so far by truck, and they couldn't go any further. The next phase that they used was mules. Now the mules we had Italian soldiers that had surrendered, taking the mules up. And they could only take the supplies so far. And all of the mule trails the Germans had zeroed in. So you'll find pictures of the dead mules, and the Germans just whacked them out as they went out there. So that means we were still up in the mountains. The only way we could get food is come from the mountains all the way down and carry our food back up on our backs, including our water. Now, when you go out, up in here, I had 27 straight days of combat without a rest. And that means you're 27 days without a shower, without a bath, without a change of clothes, without nothing, because you're limited with water. You can't move. You're into a terrific position. Now back to those hills again, just for a moment. I'll mention frozen feet in here, because up in the hills, the men had frozen feet, and they had to crawl, actually crawl, down out of the mountains on their hands and knees because they couldn't walk. And what would happen then is gangrene would set in and amputations. Now, D-Day at Anzio, I was not on D-Day. I came up a little bit later. And I love it when the historians say, well, they went in, they met light resistance, and only a few men were killed. Only a few men were killed. What type of a sentence is that? What if that's your husband, your son, your brother, and only a few men are killed? I can't understand the callousness of when they say casualties were light. Light unless it's in your family or associated with you. Then it's a heavy casualty. They were, and it was light. And when I came in later, I came in on those ships, and I came up from Anzio, or up from Sicily, or down in Naples, and came up. And when I came up, it was the first time I ever got seasick in my life. And on one of those landing craft, it was pretty bumpy and pretty bad. And I was sick, really sick. And I got out, and all of a sudden some shells hit, and I didn't feel sick anymore. I had an instant cure. Where I landed is here. About 34 years later, my wife went with me, and we went back to Anzio. A little bit of trivia. The Anzio was about 36 miles southwest of Rome. Again, it was a seaside resort like you'd go to the Jersey Shore. Same thing, beach and all. When I went back, it was beautiful. It had all beach umbrellas on it. It was very, very nice. Now, notice the land in the back. That is called the Pontine Marshes. Now, you've all heard the name Mussolini. This is one of the better works of Mussolini. Farmland in Italy is at a premium. What he did is he had the Pontine Marshes drained. When he did, I've heard various ones, 1,200 or 1,500 farms in there, and established industry into the area. It was one of the better parts, and it's a beautiful little town. It really is. This is actually D-Day. But I use this as an illustration to tell you what an infantryman does when he goes into battle. How many of you saw Private Ryan? Right? Okay. When you go into battle, you're carrying your blanket, you're carrying a shelter half, whatever you have, maybe a heavier jacket in the back. You're carrying all of your food is back in there, your K rations or C rations. You're carrying bandoliers of ammunition, you're carrying hand grenades, and you're carrying your own water. And remember, that's all the water you have. Now, I heard friends of mine say, who hadn't been in service, they said when they saw Private Ryan, that first 10 minutes and they saw it, they said they were ready to leave the movie. I said, how would you feel if you were there and couldn't leave? If you couldn't stand 10 minutes in a movie watching this, how do you think those men spent their time in there living at that time? Because it's very explicit. So these men go into battle, and then one of my friends said, oh, that American general fouled up. He didn't get his men in off the beach. I said, you ever stop to think there were German generals up there didn't want them to get off the beach? It was another part back. But when infantrymen go in the battle, that means they go in and they are not going to change clothes at all. There's no way of changing your clothes. No way of getting a hot meal many times. Now this is Anzio, and this is the Mussolini Canal in there. In the foreground, that's Americans dug in, and you'll see the farms back there. Now what was wrong with Anzio, it was all flat ground. So infantry, we could not get up and walk across the ground. It couldn't happen. Instead, we had to go through ditches. Now this is called Aprilia, or the factory. Back in the background, it's called the Alban Hills. Now, they always say in the infantry you should always go in and take the high ground. That's fine if you don't have an enemy that doesn't want you to take the high ground. And they shut us down pretty good. But this part in here, from January till May, was about the deadline. They never got any further. And it was always a scene of close combat. You see firefight in the movie. Well, a firefight is an awful thing to get into because that means you're in rifle range or close range, and even knife range, whatever it may be. So we'd kick the Germans out one day, they'd come back the next night, and it was back and forth, back and forth. But what bothered us a lot was the Alban Hills. The reason for that, up in the Germans, this is one of the railroad guns, we called it Anzio Annie. This was kept in a railway tunnel. And the Germans kept it in there during the day, and they would change the times when they would come out, and change the loads for effectiveness of target. But they would sit on those Alban Hills, and they would pick out the target 20 miles down the road. 20 miles down the road. Now, this part in here, you'll see this down in Bethesda, Maryland. The Anzio Annie, and they would bring it out, and they would fire down into Anzio and do many, many types of things. A lot of damage, a lot of damage. Now, how did we go in Anzio? The British called it waddies. I call it a drainage. We had to go back and forth. The drainage is like this. Now, you could not stay in a drainage ditch. It was impossible. Simple reason you couldn't stay in it at night. It was good cover, but you could. Germans could just go up and throw a hand grenade down in the ditch and fire a machine pistol up, and that would be it.
Exactly.
And that would be it. So you couldn't stay in it, was one.
Exactly.
And this one, you'll see again by Bill Malden, wished I could stand up and get some sleep. Now, one of the worst things for infantry is wet feet. One of the worst things for infantry is wet feet, because you have no change of clothes, nothing. And this one I like, again, Bill Malden, and it says you're using 2 blankets or 3. Now, at Anzio, what happened is, if you dug down into the hole, down to the ground, it was shallow, it was drained marshland, it would fill with water. So you couldn't go down more than a couple of feet. You couldn't go down. But now you got down, and now you had the rain, the constant rain. So remember, these men came in January, February, I had a in Italy in December, before I went up to Anzio. I did not have another shower in January. I was captured in February. I didn't get a shower till I got to Germany in June. Now, this is what happens when you're infantry. You'll see what happens here. This man has a beard on. The reason he has a beard is he's so dirty that if he tried to shave, he'd have an immediate infection. Now remember, when you're infantry and you're sitting out there, you don't get hot meals. Not that much. Maybe once in a while they try to bring something up at night and give you a break, but you don't get a hot meal. You eat out of K rations or C rations, and the only water you have is your drinking water, and that's your canteen. So there is no water to wash. Once in a while we get a break. We'd come down from the lines after 2 or 3 weeks, and then you would take your helmet, heat some water, and you would sponge bath. And that's the way you took a bath and clean up. You actually lived out of your helmet. Now, one of the biggest things that we bump into is post-traumatic stress. And it's amazing, in post-traumatic stress, they say, well, what happens? I said, it's a very simple thing. Very simple. Let's say I have 10 of you right here now, and all of a sudden you get into a artillery fire. Now, heavy artillery is usually the biggest casualty. All of a sudden you all had breakfast this morning together. That's at 8 o'clock. 12 o'clock, half of you were dead. And then maybe at 5 o'clock there was only 2 of you left, or 1. So now you start thinking, wait a minute, when is it my turn? When is it going to be my turn? Infantry in some parts had as high as 425 replacements. Now the figures I give you are factual. Now you see, when you say wounds, this is out of the Pacific. You see Purple Heart. I have a Purple Heart, and I was wounded. But there's different severity of wounds. And when I came home, and I was only 20 years old, 21 years old, and I came home, I'd been wounded on the back, and I had the scars, and they sent me to Atlantic City for recuperation. And the hospital next to me had all the amputees in Atlantic City, the old Atlantic City before the casinos. They had all the amputees in there, guys off with arms, legs, 2 legs, and they'd say, well, declare your Purple Heart. Well, I didn't worry. I had the scars, and I had it, and I could have. But I, at that time, did not feel comfortable getting the same Purple Heart as somebody who gave 2 legs. It just didn't seem equal to me. That's the way I felt. So I didn't get my Purple Heart till 50 years later, till I heard other stories. But at that time, it didn't seem that way. But when you see Purple Heart, you don't know the circumstances. Sometimes there's some tremendous stories behind these. Now we'll go in, again, to post-traumatic stress. Now, in World War I, they called it shell shock. In World War II, they called it anxiety neurosis. Now, anxiety neurosis, a lot of my friends objected to the sign because when they were treated, it makes me sound like I'm a little bit crazy, which they weren't. They had problems. Then in Vietnam, it became post-traumatic stress. And after that, now you hear, out of 9/11, you hear these cases of post-traumatic stress. Well, what happens when you get, they call it, when they get down this far, and you have men in the infantry who actually refuse to fight, and they won't. They throw it off, they walk back, and you could tell them, say, I'm putting you in, you're going to be court-martialed. Great, court-martial me. I'll go back, I'll drive trucks, I'll load trailers, I'll do anything, but I'm not going in front anymore. So people say, I never heard of that. Well, they're there. You also had Air Force men who at times, after so many missions, they were supposed to be rotated. You had men who went out on a flying mission. They lost 50% of their planes on a mission, maybe. And after they got 20 or 30, you had airmen who refused to fly anymore. Absolutely refused it. They're at the breaking point. This is what post-traumatic stress becomes. And this is the part of the man with the 1,000-mile stare, or 1,000-yard stare, whatever. When you see men come down sometimes out of the lines, you'll see men like this. You can't talk to them. They won't talk to you. There's no exchange of conversation. Now the sad part about this is what do they do with it? Well, if you go in to Alliance Hospital, which is a psychiatric hospital, you'll see men, they give them drugs, an upper and a downer. Then they have to monitor the liver to make sure they're not overly medicated. One of my best friends was very successful. You go in, he has scars all over his arms where he's cut his arms up. Every once in a while he says something wrong and they commit him. And he's back in the hospital. I thought it was strange at the time till I first joined the prisoners of war, and they had a meeting. It was one of my first meetings, and I went in, and it was a support group. And my wife came up, and my wife said, well, how did the support group go? I said, I'm not going anymore. She said, why not? I said, I think I was the only normal one in there. But my wife didn't believe that. She didn't believe that. But I found out later that about 5 or 6 of the men had been institutionalized, and you had to make allowances for them. And I've seen what post-traumatic stress does to the part. So when I tell the Air Force and them the drugs, it comes from in here. Now I told you that I would explain the frozen feet. Now this is what it looks like. This is the Battle of the Bulge. This is what the men had in Italy. When these men could turn black, the feet turned black, they'd have to get down. If they didn't get down soon enough, it would turn into gangrene. And if a gangrene set in, they'd have to have amputations. Now these boots were given after the Battle of the Bulge. I did not realize till about a few weeks ago, I watched a History Channel, that in the Battle of the Bulge, 15,000 men were returned to the hospitals with frozen feet and hands. 15,000. That's the ones they counted. They didn't count the prisoners of war that were captured in the Battle of the Bulge who had frozen feet, which would probably double the number in a hurry. So when people say, oh, I had frozen feet or frozen hands, people don't realize, anybody, the severity of it until you've lived through it. And this is what happens, and that's what it's like. Now, I went over as a replacement. I didn't go over with the original outfit. I find this last one in Windtalkers interesting because I had Indians. I was with the 45th Infantry Division, and the 45th was an Oklahoma National Guard outfit. And we had Indians in there, but they would talk on the phone with no code. Just talk, you know, back and forth, and we had no problem with it. But I was with Company E, 179th Regimental Combat Team, 45th Division. There's the factory that I showed you. Here's my spot right here. On the morning of February the 16th, they started an artillery barrage. Now the artillery barrage started low and they increased the yardage going out. Then they changed the yardage going back, and it's a saturation shelling. Now infantry, if they don't dig in, artillery is one of the biggest casualty producers out of a war. But when you go to the infantry, you dig one hole on the side to lay down with when things are quiet. Then you dig a hole straight down like this to go into if shells come. Because if you're laying down, you're more open and target. If you're down into a different type of hole, there's not much chance of you getting hit. You're going to be covered pretty well. I dug deep holes, believe me. Anyway, on the 16th they started. Then about 35, 36 German fighter planes came over and just saturated this. And I didn't find out what happened until about 35 years later, until I went out to Oklahoma in the 45th Division Museum and I picked up the book. I didn't know. Because all I know, it got very heavy. But in here, if you can imagine, the break, they put 5 waves of 500. 5 waves of 500. And threw it against our 200 here. There's about 800 on the whole line, but they picked out the one spot. We broke it on the 16th. We broke it on the 17th. But we had to drop back, way from up in here down to here. And the reason we dropped back, out of 200 men, there were 18 of us left. 18 out of the 200. So we dropped back into the secondary. That was the morning of the 17th. And we were pretty busy on the 17th, too. 18 men cannot cover a 200-yard bed. It's too much. Now this is what it was like. Now you see how the men are dug in here. These are German soldiers. They were captured in May after I was captured. But I use this because this is the illustration. Now when you saw those men come in off of those invasion ships, they came in with wet clothes. They walked 10 or 12 miles with wet clothes. They dug holes in wet clothes, and they lived in the wet clothes. There was no change of clothes, and it was January, and it wasn't warm. So they came in, but you'll see the Germans now into here and here. But you'll see how 200 men could cover a large part. Well, if you have a big territory, you have 18 men, it doesn't work. So that was on the 17th. On the morning of the 18th, I turned around and looked, there were 4 of us left. 4 of us were wounded, and we'd had, well, 3 good days of heavy combat already. With a really heavy combat, 2 very heavy days of combat. But up the road came a German tank and a company of infantry behind it. And when a tank comes up like that, and they're coming out, all they do is they wave the nozzle of the gun at you, because they don't want to waste a shell on a man or 2 men, because that means they have to go back, reload, and come back up again, getting a lot more ammunition in. So they're not going to waste ammunition and gas, so they just wave it, and the infantry takes you prisoner. Somebody said, "Gee, Zack, what did you say when you saw that?" I said, "I still say the same word on the golf course when I miss a shot. Oh, shucks." Any golfer's no different. Now, when you're captured, this is the Malmedy Massacre. The most dangerous time is the first 24 hours, because you're on the front line. Now, surprisingly enough, most of the soldiers get along pretty well. But sometimes what happens is you saw your buddy get killed and by a German soldier, and now you're going to take him prisoner. You're not going to take him prisoner. You may shoot him just to get even. So you're not going to shoot back. So when they're first captured, many times, now this was the Malmedy Massacre, and I used to tell one story, and when I did, I was in Pennsylvania doing the same slide presentation for a group of prisoners of war, and one of the men was a survivor of this. And he said, "Zack, you're telling the movie version." I said, "Tell me how it happened." So he told me. Now what happened is they were out in the field, and an SS column came down, and they had half-tracks, and they took the machine guns and they opened up on these men. And they just fired on them. That was it, because the Battle of the Bulge was getting pretty brutal up there. Now you came down, and these are the American soldiers that have been killed, and you'll notice they're numbered because they did it. And they tried to bring these men to trial later on, and some of the officers were, but they dismissed it more like an act of war. But these men are laying here, and the Germans would walk over, and they would kick the body, and if the man was alive, they would execute him with a shot to the head. And that would be, so the first 24 hours is the worst time when you're first captured. Now I put a little bit of the Air Force in here, and I told my Air Force men, I said, "I don't like the way you tell your story, so I have to add a little bit of mine." But if you stop and think, planes are shot down. Now, how many of you don't like to fly? Right? How would you like to be flying and being shot at? Another story. Now you have to bail out, and sometimes you're injured. There's something wrong. Like I described, my friend went out and his leg was gone from the knee down. The other one was millimeter shell. I can go through 100 stories, all the different little horror stories. And all of these men bailed out, and if they went out, and again, by the time they got up to 40 missions, they were just about out. They were supposed to be rotation. And some of them just would not fly anymore. And this is Regensburg, Germany, and this is the damage that they did. And I use this to illustrate what happened to the flyers. Now, when the flyers are there, and they flew over Germany, and they did this, now remember, underneath of this, all of this rubble is somebody's mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters. Your home is gone, your job is gone, everything is gone. And the flyer that did it is coming down. So when that flyer comes down, some were beaten, Some were beaten to death, some were hung, some were shot, and a few got fairly decent treatment. These stories vary greatly on the treatment when they came down. Most of them had a pretty rough time. Now the strange part of it, it's not a strange part, the German flyers that bombed London, England, when they came down got the same treatment. The German flyers that went over Russia got the same treatment. So it's a part of war. You see it destroyed, you have to vent your anger, you have to vent your feelings somewhere. Now, how did I get from Italy to Germany? In a boxcar. A boxcar is called a 40 and 8. 40 men, 8 horses. The Germans filled the boxcar up as far as they could till you were just standing, no room to lay down. You couldn't stay down, lay down. And they loaded us up in Bologna, Italy, and went up through the Brenner Pass. But all of these men had been captured about the time I had. And this was now June. In the prison camps, there were no brushes, no toothpaste, no soap, no change of clothes, and you're completely lice-infested. And all of these men had gastrointestinal problems, jammed into a boxcar. You cannot possibly imagine the odor alone. How did you go to the bathroom? What they did is they put a man-sized litter box in the middle of the road, a wooden box with dirt in it and a cover on it, and that's where you went to the bathroom. And that's how you went. And the only ventilation was that little window over there into the room. They'd stop once in a while, let us out, take a break. They had to give the guards a break out. But anyway, we went up through the Brenner Pass, and they took us up and they put us in Munich, in the Munich rail yards. And we were there 3 nights, and they locked up in the boxcars. And the British would come in and bomb at night. The British did the night bombing. And they said, the rumor we got is Hitler said he can't afford to feed any more prisoners, let them get bombed out. Then he wanted the propaganda part of the Allied flyers killing our own people. So they were looking for a two-pronged. But anyway, we lucked out. We went. It was a horrible ride. An interesting part about this is one of my friends just had a boxcar brought over, and he's going to have it out in Ohio, and it's a replica of the one that he's bringing in. Now, I go down to the Holocaust Museum. I don't like their boxcar. And the reason I don't like boxcar, it's too sanitary. I never saw a sanitary boxcar. Every one I saw looked like it had cattle in it and had been dumped in. I never saw, and I told the people down at the Holocaust Museum, I don't like your boxcar, it's too sanitary. Now, this is what Stalag 7A, and this is in Moosburg, Germany, when I went up. And we tried to get out, when we first got out of the train and we had to walk, the Germans tried to put us in line and make us march. And most of the men couldn't even march. They were in really rough shape. They were in bad shape. And they were lined up and they had their police dogs and their bared bayonets and the whole bit, and real military, very, very military. And we looked really sad. If you stop and think, the men hadn't had a shower in 6 months in the clothes they were in. So, and they were all in bad condition. And this is what Stalag 7A, Moosburg. Now I'll explain the wires as I go along. Stalag 7A was a collecting point. One part you had Russian troops, one part you had English troops, you had French troops, you had American troops, you had Indian troops from India, the ones there, British colonials. So you had a great mixture. Now this is called a delousing. This was taken after the war, but I put it in here because it's the only one I have, and these are some, but you'll see them delousing and stripping down. When we got to Stalag 7A, and you can imagine if I took everybody in this room, and you just strip down to the bottom, and they shave every hair off your head, they shave your eyebrows off, they shave your arms and your privates, every hair goes off. You got a shower. They took and deloused the clothes for me. Now I got the same clothes back with the dead lice in them. But I had a chance to wash them. And believe me, you were really lice infested. In the warm weather in Italy, we used to sit out in the sun and just take our clothes and try to take lice out, which was a losing battle. We couldn't do it. But they're lice infested. Now the Germans, I'm just going to left that there because the Germans put regulations up. And in some camps they were very strict, very strict. And I'll explain some of the regulations. Got home by one of my friends before me, and I was there, but my eyes were closed. Father thought I was blind, and she got all upset. But on the back of this is my hospital record. First I had the wounds, but then I had to work. Now officers in prison camps were not allowed to work. In my camp. Now the Air Force, since you were Air Force, you'll know, Goring had all the Air Force men put in one camp. He thought the Air Force was elite and he wanted them taken care of. So he took care of them. And they were, because they were all officers, and the officers conducted their barracks and all militarily. Senior officer in command and so on. Then you went down and non-coms weren't allowed to go out on this work. I was a PFC, I was a real Private Ryan. I had to go to work, and I worked up at an airport in Memmingen, Germany, Memmingenburg. And one day I was working, we were unloading boxcars of cement, doing everything we weren't supposed to do. And it was a small airport, and they had German fighter planes in there. And one afternoon, all of a sudden the air raid shelters went off. Well, what it was, the bombers came, and one wing of them came back towards the airport, and they bombed. Well, we had dug on the ground similar to the ones that I described, down like this. So I ran out, we started running, and we just cleared the airport. Just about got outside the airport when the first bomb started, but they saturated. And I ran down, and first one in the hole was me. Then on top of me was the next one. Then it was two German soldiers. And a bomb hit from here to the other end of the room, not even that far. The shrapnel and the dirt came down. And the German soldier started to scream when he said, "Oh my God, I'm hit." Well, I ripped open his jacket after everything settled down. All he had was a big rock, and really put a big rock and had done a job on him. But then we had dead. And I was on the dead detail. I had to go around with a group of men and pick up all of the dead bodies. And we put them in a truck. And we took them to a morgue. And we stacked them. Some of the bodies were burned in the airport. We had to use a shovel to put them in a box. We took them down, and we were stacking them down there in town, at a big funeral parlor. And we had so many bodies, we had to start throwing them up in a pile. So one guy here, we'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, and throw them up. And we went to throw one body off, the arm came off. And my friend, one of my friends started to laugh. He thought it was funny. Well, there were Germans outside watching us. The gates were there. And they didn't think it was funny, and they started coming in for us when we started laughing. Or he started laughing, not me. And fortunately, the German guards had machine pistols. They just stopped them right there. No, they protected us. They did hold us because we had the job of loading the bodies. I don't know how many, but I've heard from 100 to 800, so I have no idea. I've never had an actual figure. But anyway, when I was in the camps, I did have to work. Go back. And now I finally got farm work. Had it pretty good. I lived in a converted cow stable, and I had a little cold water in the room back, and I was able to wash. And we could wash at night. The only thing is, if we went out to the farm to work, they would have manure piles. Well, it seemed the Germans would always wait for rain to get that manure pile out. Now you'd stand in the manure pile and throw it onto an ox cart. And you had no clean socks and no clean shoes. So you can imagine what your shoes were like. Well, then I had to do construction work. They were building a milkery, a dairy. And I went out, and they had teams of oxen, and they were out there. And we were digging gravel and loading it into the wagons. It was raining. I went over, and there was an overhang of the cliff. And I went over and I got down on my haunches to get out of the rain a minute. And I was sitting in it when the whole bank came down on me. They said, "Zack, look out." I jumped forward. I got hit in the back. My neck, I was covered up to my neck, up to here, my hands. And they took me out. And they took me back in. And if it hadn't been for one German guard, I would have been either dead or crippled for life. I found a German guard who had compassion. German guards were not infantry first. They were 4Fs, men who were not fit for the front. So they were the ones guarding prisoners, the older ones. I didn't know till later that Franz had had a bad heart and one of the other guards had cancer. So I felt so indebted to Franz. But on this, in the back of this, is my hospital record. Because when I came home and I went to the Veterans Administration and they said, "Well, where did you get this?" At least I had a record. I didn't find out till years later that I had fractures in the back. And I went through it. But I've suffered. Now this one over here, the men are sleeping out because the inside of the barracks are so filled with lice and fleas, and mice just run over your body. Because they're in there and they are allowed to sleep outside. One little piece about that German guard before I forget it. I was very indebted to this guard, for Franz. So about 35 years later, my wife and I went back on a tour. I went down to the small town of Tusenhausen, Germany. I wanted to find Franz and say thank you. I went to the town. I found the town. It was a Sunday, and my wife said, "Well, ask somebody something." Well, there wasn't anybody around to ask. Finally, a man came out, and I hadn't spoken in 5 years. I don't speak it well. I only spoke a dialect. And I started talking to him. He said, "Well, wait a minute." So he walked in the house, and when he walked in the house, he said, he sent a woman out. So now this younger one came out, and she started, I told her again the same story. I was looking for Franz. She said, "Wait a minute." She went back in and brought the older woman. Now I'm telling you the story the third time. And I'm having trouble with German, getting it through. Turned out I found Franz's daughter and his widow. And I told her who I was. Well, she took me down on a tour. It wasn't even much a tour. It's only a small town, the Tusenhausen in Germany, down in the Bavarian section. But they took us into the house. I don't know where they got the desserts, but I've never had any better dessert. Gave me coffee, but I was having trouble. I couldn't talk. My wife was surprised. She never knew I could speak German. I said, "I still don't. I'm having a lot of trouble because I only spoke a dialect." But anyway, that was the part. Now we'll go back to this. I told you about the barracks and what they're like. Now, barracks, again, in officers' camps were better kept because they didn't, the men here would go out early in the morning and come in late at night. They'd be out working. Some of us would have to do lumberjack work, some would unload boxcars, did various types of work, farm work, whatever it would be. But when the shoes were off, they'd give you clogs. Now these weren't too good. He's sleeping with his hat on because you're much warmer with a hat on. Everybody knows that. In the winter, if you're out cold, put a hat on, you'll be 10 degrees warmer. So they slept with their clothes on. When they went out for roll call in the morning, they went out with their roll call and carried their blanket over their shoulders. But remember, they didn't have much in the way of sanitary conditions either. So you slept here because you only had a pot. In the winter, there wasn't enough wood. There was only a wood burning, so you didn't have fuel. This I put here to show you how much privacy you lose in your life. You don't have any privacy. Now, I told you how to explain the wires. This is a Russian soldier that tried to escape, and the Germans shot him. And when they shot somebody, they left the body stay days to let you know what they call they're having a problem. In one instance, the Germans sent a police dog in after the Russians to get them out of a barracks faster. 2 Russians killed a police dog. They took the 2 Russians, tied them to the wire and shot them. Because they had the control, and the control was bit. Now here's where the control, Now down in the middle was a separating wire. Then on this side was another wire with so many feet, and on the other side another wire. They were called warning zones. Those regulations I showed you told you that anybody walking into a warning zone would be shot immediately. Now what happened here is an American soldier tried to throw a cigarette over to a Russian soldier. The Russian soldier walked over to pick up the cigarette and he was shot, killed. Now the sad part about this is there are recorded cases of long-term prisoners of war who could not stand the confinement, who deliberately walked into this warning wire to commit suicide. They had enough, and they had deliberately committed suicide by walking into those zones. What was the diet like? In the morning, we had a cup of artificial coffee, supposedly an acorn base. What it was, I never know. And one canteen cup, no milk, no sugar in it. Lunch would be a piece of black bread, between one loaf of bread depending on the supply. So if the supply was pretty good today, maybe you got a little more. So you'd say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So now we're going to cut 6 pieces. That one loaf of bread is for 6 people. 6 people. But what happens is, today you cut it, tomorrow 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 you cut it. Cutter always takes last choice. So you measured that piece of bread out exact. Dinner was, I still remember Hitler's birthday down in Italy when they gave us some fish soup. I think the fish swam through the water and they left the fish out. But they said it was fish soup, there wasn't much substance to it. But I always remember fish soup that night. Now what did the diet like do this for you? This is dinner for 134 men coming out. That's it, 134 men. This is what it's like. This is not Holocaust pictures, these are American soldiers. You lose 100 pounds in 100 days. I had this diet for well over the 100 days. From the time I was captured, February, I was March, April, May, June. So I was over the 100 days pretty well. And I'm not that big now, but I was smaller. But it's an amazing thing to see somebody take 100 pounds off in 100 days. And then you think again, Holocaust. This is an American soldier. Some parts of the camps were up in other parts, and the supply lines were not getting into them. And they were in separated camps. And this man is still living, the last I heard about a year ago. But what happens here is you have anorexia. You die. So what happens is the body starts digesting itself. It starts living off of itself. But when you get down this far and you have this, you stop and think, I do not know of a single long-term prisoner of war who did not have severe gastrointestinal problems the rest of his life. Always trouble eating. I had one of my friends, an English soldier, I saw him about 35 years later after I came home. And he came home, all he could drink is a shot full glass of milk at a time. 1 shot glass, that's it. One of these stories I found again in Pennsylvania. I have prisoners of war. I was doing the same thing up there. And one of the men said, Zack, I was in that area of the camp. He said, you know what happened up there? I said, no, what? He said, well, the ones that were severe like this, they had a special section for them. They were trying to give them nutrition and get them back on their feet, milkshakes and whatever they could do, you know, bring them up. But some of the men were starving, and they were close. They put the mess tent over there and the men here. Now you have starving men and they see the food and some of the men actually went over, raided it, and because they were so shrunken down, they died. They died from eating. They were so hungry. They were trying to come back slowly, but I know my friend shot full glass of milk, and I have many of them. These are American soldiers being carried out. One of these men in there is a past national commander of the prisoners of war, and he has an amazing story. He had to have surgery done in a camp, and they didn't have anything, there wasn't anything there much to work with. So I think they had to use like a razor blade type thing. So the American doctor said, "Do you have to operate?" He said, "Well, what happens if I don't operate? If you don't operate?" He said, "If I don't operate on you, you're going to die." He said, "Then I don't have any choice. You know, you have to do the surgery." So he has an amazing story, and he was one of the carried out of here. He's a big guy, and he's big. He said, "Zach, I don't care what the doctors say. I'm never going to be skinny for nobody. This is it. This is me, and that's the way I'm staying." And he has a real southern drawl, but he has a tremendous story. Now, when you're in a prison camp, sometimes it depends, again, where you're at. See, the difference is if you have sanitary facilities and you don't. But this man evidently don't. As you can see, the water and the soap and the shaving. I put him here because it's one of the things in camp. He has TB. It's one of the many beside hepatitis that you picked up. Now you hear a Bataan Death March, but you don't hear the 89-day march coming down in Germany. But what happened there in Germany is as the Allies were advancing, the Germans would take the men out and move them back. They didn't want them to be recaptured. This was in the crux of winter, really. Some of the men wore their shoes off. They had put bark inside of their shoes to walk with. One of my friends in particular. It's an 89-day march. It's well documented by Dr. Kaplan, who was on it. Americans would strafe a horse column. The men would go over. They would take the hind leg off the horse, take it, cook it, out. That was their dinner. But they had no place to sleep. They were marching. So they would have, wherever they found a big barn at night, that's where they would sleep. But there was no medical treatment. And there was no food supplies. I think they said you never saw a cat or dog on the road the second time. It disappeared. The men just took it. But it's an amazing story, and one of my friends was on this march, and he has a book on it. This is some of the better French and British prisoners at the long term. They'd been there so long, longer than we had, that they were practically part of the community. They used to work in Germany so much. Now this one is forever amen hit the dirt. Because a lot of people say, well, how do you survive? And when I go into the non-commissioned officers academy, I tell them this. First, you've never met an atheist in a foxhole. Never. I didn't care if somebody, a rabbi came, a Catholic, a Protestant, if somebody said, would you like to pray, everybody prayed together. We weren't divided. We needed each other. So you didn't have that. Then the other one over here, again, is the aim hit the dirt, where do you come from? I tell the men, the NCO Academy, drugs will not help you. Drugs will do nothing for you, temporarily. Alcohol is a crutch. That won't do anything for you. Where you have to survive from is in here, in your heart and in your head. Because I tell them the same thing I tell you. I'm not a preacher, but I'm a believer. I'm a believer. I believe that everybody in this room sometime is going to be in a position in their lives where they have nowhere to turn, nobody to turn to, no parents, no relatives, somebody. You're going to be alone. You're going to be alone. I don't know what you do, but I know what I did. But as I said, I'm not a preacher, I'm not a believer, but I am a believer. This I went back, this is the Anzio Natuna Cemetery down in Anzio. It's a beautiful cemetery. I went back and I walked through there and I looked at the ages of everybody. And 20 years old, 21, and I thank God again that I was still standing. But when I do, I go out to Memorial Day because I don't have other people. And I have a problem with Memorial Day because it's not a shopping day. It's not a day that I think it should. I try to tell school children, especially, Memorial Day is to remember somebody who's lost their eyesight and been blinded. Somebody who's shed their blood, gave an arm, gave a leg, gave some part of their body for your freedom. Some who are still in hospitals who never went home 50 years later from stress. But the one that I want everybody, and especially I'm sure in here, is a Memorial Day is to remember all of these young people who gave up all of their todays and tomorrows so that you and I can be free for now and forevermore. Thank you. Okay. Now, yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Given how well some of the German prisoners were treated in Louisiana and how they go back for reunions and all, and you know that story very well.
Oh, wait.
Do you feel any resentment at any point?
No, I just wish I was an American prisoner.
No, I mean,
Over here.
it's the
No,
German prisoners in Louisiana that got that really elite treatment.
I know what treatment they had. I'm very familiar with their treatment. I know that they were allowed to have their own officers, allowed to have their own flag. They were allowed, the officers controlled the camp, not the Americans. The German officers controlled the camp. I know of one German prisoner who came home. He worked on a farm up in Minnesota or Wisconsin, one of them. He was treated so well that he came back and he bought the farm. True story. But I've also know the story about the Italian prisoners of war who used to get weekend passes on Staten Island and date the young girls.
But resentment is not part of your picture.
No, resentment's not part. It's just see, in Germany, they had bit off more than they could chew when they went to Russia and England and all of the other. And there were no medical supplies in Germany. So if you had to have a tooth out in Germany, you didn't get a shot of Novocaine. You just had a tooth out. If you had to have minor surgery, it was done without any anesthesia. I'm sorry.
That's all right. No.
Without any anesthesia whatsoever. So even in the bandages where the hospital where I was in, found out later I had fractures in my back. I had no x-rays on my back. The seriously wounded were given the anesthesia and whatever. They had minor surgery was done another way. They didn't have it. Bandages were done different. They used a lot of papered bandages. They got down so far on some bandages that they were actually washing, drying, and recycling in some of the hospitals because it wasn't there and the food wasn't there. So you saw German people scavenging for food. Towards the end of the war, it got pretty desperate. So I just thank God it didn't happen in our country, that's all.
We owe you a debt that we can never pay.
Pardon?
Our generation owes you a debt that we can never pay fully.
Well, I know. I believe that in a way because, you know, I've just started writing a piece, for that matter, a few times. I was born and raised in the coal fields of Pennsylvania, up and outside of Wilkes-Barre, up in Plymouth. And my grandfather and all were coal miners. They were real coal miners. So one of my uncles worked in the coal mines up there. And when he worked in the coal mines, he got caught between two cars and he lost his leg. But he was a self-taught artist. And he did a pen sketch, all in black, and in the back there's two mules. Then he has two miners on the side. They have the oil lamps, a young boy in the middle with a carbide lamp. And he even has pen tobacco in his pocket. It's a beautiful illustration. So it's been sitting in my family for years when you say generations. And then when I started doing it, I took it up to my hometown in Pennsylvania, and they have a museum, and I wanted to donate it. So the director of the museum, he said, "Zack, write a little story for me." I said, "I can't write much, I don't." No, he said, "Write something." So I started writing, and I told him, I said, "You know what happens?" I said, so in the writing, when I saw this, it reminded me of my grandfather. My grandfather, who used to come home black body, black clothes. And my grandmother would heat water on the stove for him to wash in a tin tub, wash basin. And he would strip down, and then he would do it, and he'd go through it. And I said, it reminds me of my grandfather, the injuries he had. My grandfather had a broken leg in the mines. And when they said it at that time, they said one leg said it right, and he always walked with a permanent limp. He lost a bicep